The Blue Mountains village of Mount Victoria has a museum housed in what used to be the old staff dormitories at Mount Victoria railway station. It's a classic little local museum, and it's stuffed with the residue of forgotten things, or things that would have been forgotten if it wasn't for this museum. This banner used to belong to a locomotive drivers' union back in the day. And this is an old Bible and an old strongbox. And these are tiles made at the Lithgow pottery at the foot of the mountains. And these are old Katoomba souvenirs. Here we have a collection of 1921 Katoomba dailies, a newspaper that went out of business last century. And here's a quilt started in 1818 by an 8-year-old girl. Here we have a guest register from the Hotel Etico in Mount Victoria, which still exists. And this is really weirdly interesting. There was once something called Mel Ward's Pyala Natural History Museum, which originally opened in 1943 in the Hydro Majestic at Medlow Bath, but then moved to Echo Point in Katoomba. When Mel died in 1966, some of his exhibits ended up at the Australian Museum, and some of them ended up here in Mount Victoria. Another interesting exhibit is a collection of artefacts associated with the construction of Cox's Road, the first road built into Australia's interior. You may remember I visited a stretch of that road in Lyndon in a previous episode. The road was built by convicts who had to live in things called stockades, and the Blackheath stockade once stood near this patch of land near the station at Blackheath. Anyway, it's nice to see that these Cox's Road artefacts have been rescued and remain in the Blue Mountains. Now, these are bricks made for a house called Bilsden Grange in Hartley in 1832, and they were made by none other than Pierce Colletts. You may remember that in my Ghost Story episode, I visited Colletts Inn, which was owned by Pierce Colletts and built 200 years ago. I also visited the cemetery where he's buried, a cemetery which is meant to be haunted by the ghost of a young girl. Upstairs in the museum are the old dormitory bedrooms, and it's a real warren up there. There's a lounge room exhibit which incorporates a grandfather clock that once belonged to William James Cleary, who in 1931 bought the Blue Gum Forest, now part of the National Park, to save it from logging. It's regarded as the state's cradle of conservation, not something I knew about till I looked at this exhibit. Next door there's a clothing exhibit with lots of antique outfits. And there's also a schoolroom exhibit. But one of the most interesting exhibits to me was this room dedicated to Osborne Ladies' College, which was open in Blackheath between 1923 and 1958. It was named after the Royal Naval College Osborne on the Isle of Wight, and it was Navy themed. The uniforms had Royal Navy buttons, junior girls were called middies, i.e. midshipmen, prefects were lieutenants, head girl was lieutenant commander, all the girls saluted each other, and the founder and headmistress, Violet Gibbons, was called the Admiral. It was all about Spartan living and physical fitness, and it sounds pretty grim. The old school burned down, but there's a new school on the grounds now, the Blue Mountains Christian School, and this is probably the old gateway. You can see the place is still pretty isolated, and you can't help wondering what it must have been like for unhappy girls at Osborne College. Makes me think there might be a book in it somewhere. And that's the nice side of forgotten things. You can resurrect them, shine some light on them again. And that's what I'm going to do for the rest of this episode. I am going to resurrect some of my forgotten books. A lot of my books were published overseas or won prizes or are still in print, but some of them have basically disappeared into nothingness. In fact, I'd be very surprised if anyone except me still has copies of them. This Way Out is the first book I ever published. It came out in 1991 and it pretty much sank like a stone. And it was very much based on my own life up to that time, as you can tell by the blurb. Bron is fed up. At 15, her life is a dreary round of school, supermarket, shopping and TV, punctuated by agonising over her wardrobe and wondering how to get away from the stifling ordinariness of Deberfield. Like thousands of other schoolgirls, Bron dreams of having perfect cheekbones and becoming a world-famous photographic model. One day she decides to answer a newspaper advertisement for models, actresses to be, and with this bold step, her life changes forever, but not entirely as she expects. This wasn't, as I say, successful, but the good thing is about those days is that you actually used to get another shot. And my second book was Pagan's Crusade, and that basically took off, which was great. An Evening with the Messiah was the first book I ever published for adult readers. It came out in 1996, and it was basically written because I'd spent some time singing in a combined choir, singing the Messiah at the Sydney Town Hall, and that experience prompted me to write this book. It was quite well reviewed, but it didn't sell much. The blurb is as follows. Maestro Leo Woods captivates all who come in contact with him. Lonely retired Dorothy, who sings in his choir, Daphne and Fiona, doting students who compete for his praise, his explosive alcoholic friend Stuart, and the strangely opaque but devastatingly handsome Jamie, who falls in love with his daughter. In fact, Leo's entire family generates an intoxicating, almost divine allure, but sometimes devotion can be a destructive thing. I love the cover of this book, and the original artwork is actually on my wall. Witch Bank was published in 1995, about 3 years after I left Westpac Banking Corporation. I used a lot of my experience in that bank to write this book, which really didn't go very well at all. For a mousy 17-year-old like Heather, starting her first job in the city is incredibly daunting, but the bank Heather has joined turns out to be no ordinary workplace. Soon Heather finds herself in the middle of a coven of modern-day witches, discussing curses over lunch and experiencing peculiar blackouts. Why does her computer turn itself on at night without any assistance? And who is that man Jasper, the striking computer technician who seems to see through to her very core? I would be very surprised if anyone, except me, still has a copy of this book. The Secret of Hermitage Isle is the first and only graphic novel I've ever written and drawn. It was actually commissioned, and it was supposed to be the first book in a series called the Bone Quest Saga, but it sold so badly that the whole idea was dropped. The good thing though is that while I was doing it, I was actually pregnant and my brain had turned to mush and I couldn't write, but I could draw. So it was terrific timing, but unfortunately didn't work out. Spinning Around was published in 2005, and it was basically, I was drawing on my experience as the mother of a young child. You can see on the front, the logline is love, marriage, work, kids, past the Dramamine. This is the American edition. It was published in America, but it still didn't do very well. Then there are these two books, The Stinking Great Lie and The Rapture. The Stinking Great Lie is an historical novel for younger readers. The Rapture is a sci-fi for teenagers. These both did very badly, though this one did get put on the notable books list for the CBC Awards, but you know, they didn't sell. However, I thought I'd arrange them around the garden so you could see how beautiful my garden is looking at the moment in spring. And there you have it, my stack of forgotten books. Maybe you might stumble across one of them someday. Meanwhile, thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, try to see whether you can find and explore any forgotten things, because I think it's worth revisiting something old once in a while.